In some cases, it was obvious. In other cases, it was less obvious. But the top three in the San Francisco Giants starting rotation in 2022, Carlos Rodon, Logan Webb, and Alex Cobb, were one of the best trios of starting pitchers in the major leagues this season. We're going to break down those three next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, we're going to be looking at Carlos Rodon, Logan Webb, and Alex Cobb, because that trio, they would have been a problem for some teams in the postseason, potentially. And they all have kind of different, very different statuses on the roster. Like Carlos Rodon is going to be a free agent after he chooses this to opt out of the option for next year. Then the Giants will give him the qualifying offer, which he'll also reject, and then he'll reach free agency. And so he's potentially an arm that you need to replace. So we're going to start with him because he was the best of the three. He was as good as we could have hoped. When the Giants signed Rodon, the title of the episode I put out was Giants sign a potential ace in Carlos Rodon. And what he established in 2022 is that he's not just a potential ace, he is a real bona fide top of the rotation arm. At least he is right now. And, you know, part of the concern about potentially giving him a long-term deal, 5 years perhaps, is that starting pitchers do not typically fare well over the course of these long-term deals, multiple year commitments. The longest Farhan Zaidi has gone to sign a free agent pitcher was 3 years, and that was to Anthony DeSclafani. And by the way, look how that went, right? In year one, basically missed the entire year with an ankle injury that required season-ending surgery. So for Rodon, what he did is went out there and had a Cy Young caliber season. He's probably not going to win the Cy Young award, but I would imagine he's probably going to finish in the top three, certainly in the top five. Without digging too much into who the other candidates are, he's up there with them. Probably not going to win, but really, I mean, the ERA ended up being really good at 2.88, but the peripheral numbers suggested that much better performance was even possible, and the defense didn't do him any favors. It didn't do the Giants pitching staff as a whole any favors this year, but the expected ERA based on, you know, the things that were directly in control of Rodon, like strikeouts, walks, and homers, combined with, strikeouts and walks, and then combined with quality of contact data, suggested a 2.64 earned run average was deserved for Carlos Rodon. And the fielding independent pitching was all the way down at 2.25, which was, I think, actually the best in the major leagues this year for starting pitchers. And so when all was said and done, I mean, the strikeout rate, 33.4%, just dominant stuff across the board for Carlos Rodon. Fangraphs wins above replacement, which uses FIP instead of ERA, was at 6.2, which was first among all major league starters. And the runs allowed per nine WAR, which I kind of prefer, honestly. It does not use FIP. It doesn't even use ERA. It just uses runs allowed per nine. Runs, not just earned runs. So, you know, sometimes there's borderline defensive calls, and this just takes all of that out of the equation and just says how many runs did you allowed and what was that worth in terms of wins above replacement. And for Rodon, he comes in there at 5.3, which is a very healthy number in 178 innings. Speaking of health, Rodon was basically healthy all season long. He did miss his last start of the year with this kind of unclear, either he was sick or it was because of Scott Boras saying that he shouldn't have to make that last start because the Giants had been eliminated and they should protect him like they did with Logan Webb, putting Webb on the IL as well. right before the end of the season, just in order to kind of manage his workload with the Giants out of contention. So they got ace production out of Rodon, but he's very possibly going to leave. It's very similar to what we saw last year with Kevin Gausman. Gausman went to Toronto, where he put together a really good season as well. Although what I would say, looking at the numbers, is that Rodon ended up out-pitching Kevin Gausman. And so just in 2022, they didn't really lose anything production-wise going from Gausman to Rodon. Now, certainly people make the case they could have had both. Why not, if you know Rodon's going to be good and you believe Gausman was going to be good and you have Webb, why not bring back Gausman and bring in Rodon? I mean, it's hard for me to argue with that, except I really do believe they are very hesitant to give 5-year, $100+ million deals to pitchers. I think they would do it for a position player, for the right position player. They did offer Bryce Harper 12 years, $310 million in the first season under Farhan Zaidi, but I don't know if I see them doing that for a starting pitcher. And so Rodon is going to be a fascinating case to watch as the offseason begins, which is after the World Series ends, when free agency opens, 5 days after the World Series ends. So his case for the Giants is going to be very interesting, but do not be surprised if he ends up leaving. But in my opinion, they'll have to replace that front of the rotation type production, which they've basically stated. Zaidi said they'll be seeking, whether it's Rodon or someone else, a front of the rotation arm. And so far they've done a good job finding those types of arms. And there are guys out there in free agency, Justin Verlander potentially, and Jacob deGrom, and Clayton Kershaw. I mean, as unlikely as that may be, he is a free agent. So they'll have some choices. And then there's also trade candidates. We've been fantasizing about a Shohei Ohtani trade, which would help you obviously in the rotation and in your order. So anyway, that was Carlos Rodon. Bulldog mentality, bully on the mound. I think it was Kruko or Kuiper who called him a bully, and I think it's a great way to describe him as he pitches on the mound. He's very an imposing figure, to be sure. So coming up in just a minute, Logan Webb had a breakout season in 2021. He followed it up with a very good, but maybe not quite as good season in 2022. We'll get into Logan Webb in just a second. But before we do, betonline.net is your #1 source for football betting info this season, and football is obviously in full swing. 49ers, what does BetOnline have to say about their upcoming matchups? You can check that out. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting up to the minute scores for every sport out there, including baseball. We've got odds on these upcoming series. We've got odds on what the ALCS lines will be, if it's Guardians versus Astros versus Yankees and Astros. And then how about Phillies, Padres? That's kind of a wonky series. I would say pretty evenly matched. And you can see what BetOnline has to say about that. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, golf, whatever. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. All right, as promised, we are going to get into Logan Webb a little bit. Like I said, he had this breakout 2021 season, was just phenomenal, and then carried it into the playoffs. Like he had something like a 5.5 or 6 ERA in the first couple months of the year, or month and a half or so, and then he just went on a tear where he was absolutely, I forget, was it 3 runs or fewer in like 20-something straight starts, something like that, where he just was dominant. And he ended up with a strikeout rate that was significantly better than average and a ridiculously high ground ball rate and negative average launch angle against him. So when you're striking people out, he wasn't walking anybody either, and just severely limiting damaging type of contact. Like keeping the ball on the ground and striking people out is just a great combination, and not walking anybody. So Logan Webb looked to have arrived last year, and he ended up with a 3.03 ERA, 3.18 expected ERA, 2.72 FIP, just across the board, very strong in 148 1/3 regular season innings. And then of course he pitched twice 14 and 2/3 innings in the NLDS against the Dodgers, and was great in those 2 starts. And then this year, while what I said was that he maybe wasn't quite as good, but actually the ERA is better. He followed up from a 3.03 ERA in 21 to a 2.90 ERA in 2022. But actually, this is a perfect example of needing to know what league average is, because according to this number, ERA minus, it's like the same, it's the inverse of ERA plus. ERA plus, if you're at 120, it means your ERA is like 20% better than average. But if you do ERA minus and you're at 80, it means your ERA is 20% better than average. So I do minus because ERA is a number where lower is better. And so for pitching numbers like ERA minus, FIP minus, I like the lower numbers equaling better. So anyway, he was at a 74 ERA minus in 2021 and a 73 ERA minus in 2022. So almost identical, even though there's actually a 0.13 point gap in the ERAs. It's because league average earned run averages went down this year because offense was suppressed. But so what stands out, even though the ERA was better this year than it was last year, the peripheral numbers were a little bit worse. The expected ERA was actually all the way up at 3.59. The FIP was at 3.04. And, wins above replacement, 4.2. Runs allowed per 9, wins above replacement, 4.3. And last year he was around those same numbers, but in fewer innings. So he was a little bit better in 2021 than he was in 2022, but he was still very good in 2022. And Logan Webb is a total development success story. He's going to turn 26 years old in November. He's going to be arbitration eligible for the first time this upcoming offseason. And so he's finally going to make some money. And also there's this pre-arbitration bonus pool, although he's not pre-arbitration anymore. So actually I don't think he's eligible. I'll have to look into it's part of the new collective bargaining agreement is this new pre-arbitration bonus pool where players can basically get more money if they perform well, even if they're pre-arbitration, meaning they could be making league minimum salaries, yet they can get some extra cash for performing well. It's something the players really wanted built into this new CBA, and they got it. I think the total pool is like $50 million, and it's going to be split up among the best performing pre-arbitration players, which I don't think will apply to Webb since he is first-year ARB eligible. But he's been making close to the league minimum for the last several years with the Giants here, and this offseason he's going to get a payday of probably around $5 million for his 2023 salary. So that's great. I'm always happy when, young players finally get paid significant money for the first time. Not like $700,000 isn't significant money, but, $5 million a year is pretty nice when you're a 26-year-old baseball player. And so, yeah, I mean, his emergence is really important to the Giants. It gives them, if you can go out and get your Rodon archetype, whether it's Rodon or somebody else, just kind of fill in the blank with an ace and then pair him with Logan Webb, who, the beauty of arbitration and pre-arbitration players is that you can go year to year. You continue to have team control. You can bring them back, but if something goes wrong, if the performance suffers, or if there's an injury, you have the option of just non-tendering the player and getting out from underneath the commitment. There is no commitment. Year to year, there's a commitment, but that's it. And so it's really nice to have like a really strong performer in the rotation in Webb who's arbitration eligible and they can go year to year. But when they start getting closer to free agency, as Webb is getting closer, he has 3 more years of team control, 2023, 24, and 25. And then he would be set to reach free agency after the 2025 season. And when this happens, when you start getting to the point where they become eligible for arbitration, you get to like 3 years of team control left, you really do start to think about, can we or should we extend the player? And what you do basically, because Logan Webb, he hasn't earned anything yet except league minimum salaries. And then even if you agree to this $5 million 2023 salary-ish, through the arbitration process, it's only a $5 million guarantee. And like I said, next year is not guaranteed for him. He could have an arm injury and just his career could be over. I'm not obviously wishing that upon him, but it's always possible. But so that's why players can be open-minded to team-friendly extensions. And at this point, the team starts to also want it, because what they risk is that Webb could keep being good, be good this year, in 2023 again, and then it becomes harder and harder to convince the player to agree to a team-friendly extension as they get closer to free agency. And then once they get real close to free agency, they're often thinking, I just want to, have another good season and see, get my market value out there. So all I'm trying to say is it can really make sense at about this point in a career for a good young player to work out an extension. And what it would do is guarantee, buy out the arbitration years. And so you're guaranteeing the player not just a 2023 salary, but a 2024 and a 2025 salary as well. And whatever those salaries end up being, say $5 million in 2023, $9 million in 2024, and like $14 million in 2025, it does get progressively higher generally. And then you give yourself maybe buy out one free agent year, or make that year a team option year. Maybe you buy out one free agent year and then you put a club option on the next year after that. It's just simply time to start thinking about Logan Webb as an extension candidate, because he's getting closer to free agency and there's pros to both sides. And he's that important to this team. I mean, obviously it is 3 years down the road, but it is time to start thinking about that. And he would reach free agency, 3 more years. He would be 28, right? At the end of the year in which he would be entering the free agent market, turning 29. He'd be turning 29 in November. So anyway, that was Logan Webb. He continued to have an elite ground ball rate. I just want to say he's one of the top ground ball pitchers in the game, as is the guy we're going to talk about next. But Logan Webb, third in Major League Baseball, minimum 140 innings pitched. His ground ball rate of 56.7% was third in Major League Baseball. But the strikeout rate is really what wasn't as good this year. It went down from 26.5% last year to 20.7% this year. So a significant drop there. The velocity on the fastball was also down a little bit on average, but still he just continued to be very effective. But speaking of ground balls, and by the way, Webb, career high, 192 and a third innings. So, he definitely increased it and it was high, but they did shut him down from making that last start. But he was healthy all year until they shut him down. But he could have made the start if the Giants were still in contention. But speaking of ground balls, the next player we're going to talk about, when I said some of these guys were just obviously very good, Alex Cobb was less obviously very good, but good he was if you dig underneath kind of the surface level numbers and look at some of the underlying stuff. And Alex Cobb is looking like one of the better free agent signings this front office has handed out. We'll get to Cobb in just a minute, but first. All right, as promised, Alex Cobb, not as obvious of a great season, and certainly he had some ups and downs. And early on in the year, he was the poster child. That's such the wrong phrase, but he was just the perfect exemplification of the Giants' defensive issues, because he had literally the best expected ERA in Major League Baseball, and yet his ERA was one of the worst in Major League Baseball. There was just nobody who was being more of a victim, it seemed, to the Giants' bad defense early in the year than Alex Cobb. Now, some of it is not just the defense, some of it was luck as well, but he appeared a combination of unlucky and just having bad defense around him for a significant portion of the beginning of the season. But as is often the case, the ERA ended up getting dragged down much closer to where the peripheral numbers were early on. So, he started out a month and a half in, like Webb last year, or in 2021, he had an ERA closer to 6 after about a month and a half, but the peripherals were in the high 2s. And if you look at what was the ERA starting when he had that ERA of 6 until the end of the season, it was something like in the high 2s or low 3s, and so the better predictor of what those next 4 months were going to look like was in fact the peripheral numbers after the first 2 months and not the ERA itself. And so that's why we make a bunch of noise about, ignore the ERA to a large extent and look at these peripheral numbers. They're more predictive of what he's going to do and more indicative of what the talent is under the hood. for Alex Cobb. So when all was said and done, he pitched 149 and 2/3 innings. He had a 3.73 earned run average, a 94 ERA minus. So about 6 points better than league average there for ERA. This is also park adjusted ERA minus. All these numbers with pluses and minuses tend to be park adjusted. But the expected ERA was 3.17, so just significantly lower than the 3.73 earned run average. And the fielding independent pitching was 2.80, almost a full run below the ERA. And so, I mean, I can go on and on about the reasons. He didn't strand as many runners as we would expect. Pitchers generally just strand kind of a standard percentage of the base runners they allow, about 72%, and he only stranded 68%. Also, the average on balls in play against him, 336, is very high. His career average on balls in play is 297. And so I can largely attribute that to defense when he's an established pitcher. And when you have a long established average on balls in play against you, that's very normal and in line with what average is. And yet 1 year you just suddenly see a big spike. It's a combination of luck and defense, in my opinion. Strikeout rate above average. He's kind of like Logan Webb. If you just look at the numbers, there's a lot of similarities to Logan Webb. Strikeout rate was actually higher than Logan Webb's this year, kind of in between Webb in 2022 and Webb in 2021. And he doesn't walk a lot of people either. And the ground ball rate, I mentioned that Webb was third in Major League Baseball, minimum 140 innings. Well, Cobb was second. There's only one pitcher in baseball, minimum 140 innings, who had a higher ground ball rate, and that was Framber Valdez of the Houston Astros. But Alex Cobb, 61.5%. The average launch angle against him was just ridiculously low as well. And I would venture to say, as I'm pulling it up here, it's probably going to be second behind Framber Valdez, and it is, at 1.8 degrees average launch angle. Logan Webb, by the way, third in Major League Baseball at 3.1 degrees. So you're striking people out at a slightly above average rate. You're not issuing a lot of walks, and you're just keeping the ball on the ground. It's how the Giants had such a good home run rate against them. They just simply did not allow a lot of home runs in 2022. And Webb and Cobb were extremely good in that regard, and it's a sustainable skill. And if you can put a good defense in the infield behind these guys, then I think that you'd see the ERA end up being closer matching to the peripherals, and the peripherals were just so good. I mean, 2.80 fielding independent pitching for Cobb. Is that what I said? 2.80. Yeah. I would again venture to say that when I sort here by fielding independent pitching, it's going to be one of the best in Major League Baseball. In fact, it was 8th best in Major League Baseball. The guys ahead of him, Rodon was first, Kevin Gausman second, Ohtani, Verlander, Aaron Nola, Max Scherzer, Max Fried, Alex Cobb, Shane Bieber, Zach Wheeler. And then Logan Webb at 14th overall. So, yeah, I mean, all three of Webb, Cobb, and Rodon in the top 14 in baseball in fielding independent pitching for starting pitchers. Minimum 140 innings, just tells you how good these guys really were. The defense didn't do them favors, but even just by ERA, they still were good. It's not like they were bad by ERA and FIP says, no, they were good. It's like they were good, but they could have been even better if they had a better defense, is what I see when I look at these numbers. And the contract status for Cobb is that it's looking like one of the better contracts that this front office has given, because he is under contract for next year at just $9 million, same salary as he made in 2022. And then there's a $10 million club option for yet another year in 2024, and it has a $2 million buyout. So he's guaranteed $11 million over 1 year, but it could end up being $19 million over 2 years. And either way, it looks like a really solid deal for the Giants, beyond solid, a good deal for the Giants. The one thing is Cobb is 35 years old. He just turned 35 a few days ago. So he'll be, 35 all of next year. And so you worry maybe about regression and injuries and stuff. He also was throwing career high velocity after working with Driveline over the offseason. Way career high. I mean, his fastball touched, I think, 98 a few times this year. He used to be a low 90s fastball velocity. And now he's throwing his sinker. It's not just a straight fastball. It's a big movement pitch in the upper 90s. And now his splitter is averaging close to what his fastball used to average, around 90 miles an hour, 91. So Cobb, I mean, he could just definitely, if you bring back an ace, whether it's Rodon or somebody else, and Webb and Cobb, those three can be a really good 1-3 kind of matchup with anybody in the game and could be a real problem in October if the Giants can get there. So anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast, Locked On MLB, on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow every single weekday here at Locked On Giants. So can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.